You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
2 weeks of that recording, Brendan, did you miss me?
I don't feel comfortable answering that, to be honest. I feel like it'll be used against me if I say yes.
What if you say no?
Well, then, I don't know.
Welcome back to Arsenal Pass, episode 97. We are back from a 2-week hiatus. Although we didn't have a break in episodes, we did run a mailbag episode last week, which we had a lot of fantastic questions for. So massive shout out and thanks to the Arsenal Pass community over on our Discord and on Twitter for all the awesome questions. I think we answered like just shy of 50 questions, Brendan. So if you haven't checked that episode out, make sure to go and do so. A lot of juicy questions in there, great questions about format, about the game overall, about outsiders, about, current Flesh and Blood things as well. Make sure before you listen, how many times do you think Brendan mentions Wizard and how much do I mention Brute before you jump in? Spoiler, it's a lot lower than you might think. Brendan, this episode we are talking about the last 2 weeks of events. We've had a calling, we've had 2 battle-hardened events, one of them Blitz, which we aren't touching on, but we do have Tariq Patel joining us for the main topic of the pod and diving into his run to top 8, playing Briar, plus just the metagame overall and where we expect things to sort of lead into as we close out this Dynasty meta before Outsiders, just a month away at this point. And we do have Calling Auckland, which is kind of the final big event, plus a couple of battle hardens to round us out. First of all, Brennan, your week in Flesh and Blood. I know you obviously didn't go to Indianapolis for your last 2 weeks, but have you been playing some Flesh and Blood? Have you managed to get to any events, or I guess nothing really to test for at the moment, just kind of Outsiders wait period?
Yeah, so I actually made it out to a few local events recently, mostly to play against Brody, because Brody's actually local to me. So it's like if I ever want to practice in person, I just had the itch to play cards, like physical cards for some reason. So I went to a couple events. I played some Blitz. I played quite a bit of Icelander and Class Constructed. But yeah, I mean, I had a good time. I think that you're right. Like there isn't too much to be testing for. There's no big crunch quite yet, although it's coming here in the near future for Pro Tour Baltimore. So yeah, I've been able to get out to some events, and I was enjoying my time.
Nice. What did you play? Just Icelander, or did you try any other decks out?
So Icelander, and then I played Peter's Canalist and Blitz, and I told Peter. I mean, like Hayden, when you post a YouTube video of one of your lists, and then you get that person who DMs you is like, hey, this card should be in the list. So I did that with Peter's list. I played Peter's list and then angrily was like DMing him like in the middle of like my round. I was like, hey, you should be playing Potion of Deja Vu. What the heck? So yeah, I played some Kano and Blitz and Icelander and Classic.
Nice. Yeah, we've all had those. We can, I mean, I just got back from a holiday, so I haven't played as much Flesh and Blood. But basically very minimal since the ban suspended announcement that came the week before Indianapolis. So I'm excited to dive back in, post my wee break. I went home for a week and a half. Of course, Calling Auckland next weekend. I will be there, so that gives me about 8 or 9 days to work out what I'm going to play, test the format a bit. Obviously, we have a lot of information and things to go off post Indianapolis and Battle Hard in Bologna, which is really exciting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to be playing a lot of Flesh and Blood over the next 7 days, I think, which is I'm looking forward to, because I think this format looks reasonably diverse, which spoiler we'll talk about with Tariq.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm really interested to see if Outsiders has an impact on the current Class Constructed meta, because I think you and I, since we didn't talk about this in the pod, we can talk about it right now. Actually, we talked about sort of the powering down of sets post Tales of Aria, which is probably a good thing for the game overall, but does leave us in this weird spot where we have these old heroes from those sets sort of lingering around, like the old hymns, the Briars, of course, which hasn't Living Legend yet, and I know Icelander's kind of made it up there. But yeah, I mean, this being a Ranger heavy set, also with a bit of Ninja, I do hope that we are able to have a set that impacts Classic in a big way. And I think if it doesn't, that we might see a little bit of help from Big Brother in terms of additional bans.
Well, I really hope it does have a reasonable impact. I wouldn't want it to have, just be like Outsiders meta where the top 3 heroes are, Azuri, New Arachne, and Azalea, for instance. But I would like it to have an impact. I'd like to see Assassin have an impact on this next format. I would like to see, Katsu get the bump it needs with this to be in that sort of tier 2 minimum sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, definitely optimistic, and we'll see. But like you say, it has been this kind of bell-shaped curve of power, and we're coming down the other side of it at the moment. Is that long-term? Not sure, but it does seem to me that Outsiders is going to be less powerful overall than sets like particularly Monarch and Tales of Aria, where we had really high power levels, and we've felt the effects of those sets right through to now, and to the point that, and we kind of allude to this a little bit when we talk with Tariq, but Dynasty hasn't had maybe the impact we would expect, because the power still of the heroes that didn't get the bump in the form of Icelander, Fi, Ultim, Briar, etc. But yeah, anyway, why don't we jump straight into some news, Brendan, and talk a little bit about Outsiders, because we have had preview cards drop for Outsiders while we've been away over the last 2 weeks, and we haven't caught up, so we are 2 weeks behind. Have you seen these cards? First of all, we were shown the cold foil tokens, which were revealed at Indianapolis. I believe they're on the prize wall. Those were the Bloodrot Pox, the Inertia token, and the Frailty token. Just for those, if you haven't heard what those do, I'll just quickly give a bit of an overview, and then Brendan, let's talk a little bit about these. So Bloodrot Pox is a token. It says at the beginning of your end phase, destroy Bloodrot Pox, then it deals 2 damage to you unless you pay 3 resources. It's an aura. These are all auras. Frailty is your attack action cards played from Arsenal, and weapon attacks have -1 attack, and at the beginning of your end phase again, destroy Frailty. Inertia is at the beginning of your end phase, destroy Inertia. Then all cards from your hand in Arsenal go to the bottom of your deck. So these 3 tokens, and then we've seen 3 cards already, which are all assassin attack actions that produce these tokens in the form of Infect, Sedate, and Wither. I'm not going to read these all out, but effectively they're 0 cost at red, common, so there's a cycle of them presumably. 0 for 3s that have the keyword Stealth, which we've now don't know what it does, but we know that it's a very unique effect, and that it doesn't trigger. If you saw, did you see the post that Josh Scott put out?
I saw the TLDR of the post, which is we still don't know what it is.
Yeah, literally. So these cards have Stealth, and when they hit, they create each of these tokens. So Infect creates a Bloodpox, Sedate, an Inertia token, and Wither, a Frailty token. So these are post seeing Razor's Edge. These are the new cards that we've seen, and we also saw some attack reactions: Spike with Blood Rot, Spike with Frailty, Spike with Inertia that give attacks +3, and whenever they hit, they do the effect, which is give the token. So, Brendan, any kind of like first thoughts on seeing these cards and these tokens?
Well, I saw Inertia, and I was like, oh. Just the Kano inside me was like, come on, man. Honestly, I haven't. I mean, it's a very early to start doing a lot of speculating, but I haven't dove too deep into them, to be honest. But the way it's worked with Flesh and Blood spoilers, and it's just like they tend to spoil everything all at once nowadays. It's a very short period. We do get a trickle before then, but I kind of put it off a bit before I start getting the old cooker going in terms of speculation, because we do get so much in such a small amount of time, and every time I early speculate on Flesh and Blood cards, I am dead wrong.
It looks silly. Yeah. No, likewise, we tend to look quite silly. LSS do have a habit of making us look silly, Brendan. But my kind of first take on these is just quite cool. Like I've definitely had some reservations about the set from a constructed standpoint. Limited, I'm really excited about the 6 hero dynamic, and I actually think what we've seen so far, I'm really excited for these kind of on-hit effects and these sorts of attacks that we're going to see for Limited. But yeah, I mean, these tokens seem powerful, like their effects. I mean, you talked about Inertia, this kind of effect. It's similar to, there was a Ranger card that did this effect, where you can't, what's the card I'm thinking of? Seek and Destroy. Seek and Destroy, very similar. Where basically you're not going to be able to Arsenal, and you can't hold a card in Arsenal. It's effectively what Inertia says. Frailty, very interesting for go wide decks. These your attack actions played from Arsenal and weapon. So if you're trying to attack the weapon and attack action from Arsenal, -2 for the turn effectively. And then this thing of just Blood Pox was just another way to present damage, and another kind of, it reminds me a little bit of what we've seen with Looming Doom. This end of turn effect that kind of ticks away if you don't have a way to stop it, which is in this case 3 resources. And then of course, Brendan, we've seen a few other cards as well. So we've seen Death Touch, which is the first Assassin Ranger hybrid attack action that we've seen so far. So either Assassins or Rangers can play this card. At red, it is a 1 for attacks for 6 and defense for 2. Death Touch can't be played from hand. And it says when this hits a hero, create a Frailty, Inertia, or Bloodpox token under their control that you choose. So quite a cool card to see. We've also seen the first Quiver for Ranger, this Majestic Quiver equipment, which is a Quiver can be equipped in a weapon zone in addition to a hero, so you can have the bow plus the quiver, and effectively you start with this as you would with any piece of equipment. and it's an instant 3 resources. Reveal the top card of your deck. If it's an arrow, put it face up into your arsenal and destroy quiver of rustling leaves. So you get this kind of one-off extra pop it an extra arrow into your arsenal, which is quite cool. And we've also seen Bonds of Ancestry, which is a ninja attack action, which very long. Go and check it out. I'm not going to read through it, but it's effectively, it combos with cards that have Gust Wave in the title and looks quite powerful. So with Bonds of Ancestry, you know, plus these cards we've seen so far, quite excited about Outsiders, I think, Brennan. You know, we've seen, they've given a strategic little bit of a taster of things to come, I think, with what we're going to see with Assassin and what Assassin looks like in the set, which is these negative effects, these tokens, what we're going to see with Ninja, you know, extensions of combo lines that we've seen in the past, a first look at a quiver for a Ranger. It looks all, you know, quite cool, I would say. So I'm excited to, you know, my anticipation for Outsiders is definitely building.
I've been waiting for a quiver since, like, literally Arcane Rising, so I'm happy that we finally get it. I thought it was never going to come.
Yeah, now you have it, what, 2.5 years later, you've got your quiver.
Yep, and Ranger will still suck. No, I'm kidding. Relax, everybody.
What do you have a particular, like, my favorite card I think we've seen so far is probably Death Touch. Just, you know, this ability now for Rangers to play attack actions that are Ranger cards. So they do have the same constraints as your arrows effectively, in the fact that they can only play from Arsenal. But I think there's some cool things you can do with reload into an attack action, which you couldn't previously do. And quite like 1 for 6, like, you know, that has an on-hit effect is really powerful.
Yep, 1 for 6 is very good. Very, very good. That's like a Wartune Herald, right? I'm less excited for an individual card that's been spoiled so far, and more excited, speaking of Illusionists, actually, for the Assassin class to be fleshed out. So I feel like Assassin is in a similar place that Prism was pre Everfest, and I think that this will actually kind of bring us to the full fruition of the cast and, I don't know, make it more fun to play, maybe make it more viable, et cetera, et cetera. That's honestly what I'm most excited for here.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We'll move on from Outsiders. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about Outsiders as we get closer to the March 20th release. Of course, we do have the spoiler season. I want to say it's the 4th to the 6th of March. It's a very shorter season that LSS posted about. We do have a preview card that we will be releasing. I don't know if we've got our confirmed date, but obviously it's within that window. Have not seen it at this point yet, Brendan. But, you know, LSS have blessed us the last few seasons with some pretty spicy cards, Scour notwithstanding. But, you know, we've had...
Scour was a cool card. I think cool. Scour was cool. Scour was a cool card. The one they gave... Which one was the one they gave us? Oh, so no, they gave us Pulse Wave Harpoon last time.
And
then they
Crown.
gave us... Well, oh, yeah, Crown of Providence. What was before that? There was one they gave us, and it was like with... One, yeah, was that the one that was like without, we didn't know what a frostbite was or like anything like that? And we're like, how do we even talk about this?
Yeah, we knew nothing.
We knew nothing. We're like, there's no context to this. So like, I guess it's a 4 for 8.
Yes, but I mean, we needed no context for Crown of Providence because that card was the best card in the set.
But Skullcap, those people.
I want to give a big shout out. Of course, a lot of events happened over the past 2 weeks, as we said. Michael Hamilton winning yet another calling, who's surprised. We also saw, you know, you were talking about Peter Bedinsky winning the Battle Hardened, I think, on Kano. And I was looking for the Battle Hardened Bologna winner's name. Do you know, there was very little coverage on Battle Hardened Bologna, so I'm not sure if you picked up the name of the winner, so I'm very sorry. But winning on Bravo, much to Brendan's disdain. Congratulations on the big win.
How dare they?
But yeah, of course, next weekend is the Calling Auckland. I'll be there. If you're going to be there, come and say hello. I'm really looking forward to getting back to New Zealand and playing in this event. And hopefully the cyclone is kind of dispersed by then. So yeah.
Yeah. What is a cyclone? Is that like is it a hurricane?
Good question. I think it's more like as opposed to like hurricanes and tornadoes that have a big spinny thing. It's more like a big weather front that passes through with a lot of strong winds and low pressure systems, I think.
I always thought a cyclone. Wait, what? I feel like you would know what a cyclone is. No, I when I think of cyclone, I think of cycle, and it makes me think of circle, and I'm like, okay, it's also a circle. Is it just a hurricane? But if you're in a different part of the world, they call it a cyclone. You know what? Let us know in the YouTube comments below. What is a freaking cyclone versus like a hurricane?
You might be right, because I think cyclones are tropical, right? So you might be right. Here you go. In meteorology, a cyclone is a large air mass that rotates around a strong center of low atmospheric pressure clockwise in the northern hemisphere northern hemisphere, counterclockwise and north clockwise in the southern hemisphere. There you go, Brendan. So
Bro, that's a hurricane. You just got your own word for it. It's just like you calling flip flops thongs. It's just being. It's probably some differentiation, but yeah, let us know.
Should we talk about Flesh and Blood?
Oh yeah.
Not really much else to talk about. We can just move on to the Command Cookout, I think, if you're ready.
Mm-hmm. Let's do it.
We've got a question this week from. Make sure I get this name correct. From our community Discord from Vilsik. And the question is, what would an ideal but still realistic metagame look like in terms of hero representation and win percentages from your point of view? And the reason I wanted to pick this question out, Brendan, is literally because we are talking this current format with Tariq and the main topic of the pod, and we do touch a bit on, kind of representation and the kind of difference Indianapolis to Bologna, but also seeing quite a widespread hero sort of pool. So I want to ask you, what would an ideal metagame look like to you? What does a healthy metagame look like in your eyes? Is it about hero representation? Is it about, getting different heroes into the top 8? Is it, what does it look like?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in that sort of the pie is not necessarily correlated to a healthy metagame. And we've seen that before. We've seen that quite a lot. That like sometimes there can be a lot of heroes showing up, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a healthy metagame. A healthy metagame for me is I want to feel like I can be competitive on more than sort of one deck and each individual archetype. That's ideal. But I also want to feel like all the different archetypes are sort of represented in said meta at a competitive level. So when a meta, like if we look at Pro Tour number 2, I would define that as an unhealthy meta. It was a heavily aggressive meta, and it felt like you could really only be playing one aggro deck. But at the same time, it still felt like aggro was just a cut above everything else. It felt like the Briar deck was ahead of Oldhim. It was ahead of Prism. Maybe it had a bad matchup in the Isolator, but Isolator couldn't even show up, right? Because Prism was so bad for it. So I think that was a particularly narrow and unhealthy meta, not because Briar was so popular, but because it felt like you had to play Briar or you were literally just playing below 50% in most of your matchups that you would face because so much Briar was there.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Like the big part for me is the percentage of hero spread you see. I agree. It does not lead to a healthy metagame. And I think trying to say, what does a healthy metagame look like in terms of win percentages or the metagame sort of spread. I really agree. I don't think it leads to a healthy metagame. It's more about what are the strategies that people are enacting, because you can have, and we've had this before, right? It's like, oh, look, there's lots of fire, there's lots of Briar, and there's lots of dash, and it's like, yeah, it's just 3 flavors of the same aggro deck that's just trying to ignore what their opponent's doing and just attack face, right? Like we've had formats like that, and I don't think that's a particularly healthy metagame, right? But if you look at it, you go, wow, we've got 5 heroes in the top 8 here, and we had 7 heroes in the top 16, and we had no hero have over 20% representation or something. It's like, that looks healthy on the surface, but I don't think that the feel of the metagame, the feel of the play and the gameplay itself is actually necessarily going to be healthy because of that. So I'm more interested when it comes to what does a healthy metagame look like. I'm more interested in, like Brendan was saying there, what are the strategies that are viable? Is it viable to show up with a deck that can disrupt? Is it viable to show up with a deck that can be aggressive? Is it viable to show up with a mid-range deck? Is it viable to show up with a more traditional control style deck? And are you then a metagame where you get to metagame that's a healthy metagame to me. A metagame where you can show up and go, okay, these strategies are viable. I'm going to pick a deck that tries to attack an angle of the meta. I think that's a much more healthy metagame, and without risk of getting some backlash. Brendan, Tales of Aria sort of Everfest meta were more those kind of metas to me. So,
now, what do you mean? Everybody complained about that meta. How is that possible? I agree with you. I felt like that meta, when the meta was really immature back when the person we're talking to on this pod very soon, Tariq Patel, won U.S. Nationals. The meta looked narrow for like a tournament or two, but it was actually very ripe to disruption, and we saw that happen over the course of that meta. Especially, Hayden won Australian Nationals on Viserai specifically. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, my go-to example for a bad class constructed meta is going to be Pro Tour number 2. And I think that's like the sort of the best example we have so far. It just felt like aggro was just a cut above the rest. And it was, you couldn't even play like the other aggro decks. It felt like you could show up on them, but Briar was just better than, it felt like everything at that time. It was mostly because of Prism, which was what we found out, because Prism kept all the true Briar counters out of the meta.
Yeah, yeah, yep. The ultimate decks that were really ticked for it they couldn't show up with. You had to be able to, you had Icelander, like you're saying, just get completely shut out of the meta by Prism. So yeah, look, I think it's a great question though, because I think the question is about representation and percentages, and I think kind of our answer to that is that those aren't the metrics for a healthy metagame, which is really important. We've seen Battleheart and Bologna last weekend. The most played deck was 13% of the meta. I think that's good. Like, it's really exciting that we see that. We see a real diversity of heroes, and the top 8 was really diverse as well. And actually, I think that was, that is a sign of, not that's a sign, but I think what actually happened in that meta was pretty healthy. There was a lot of different strategies being acted in there. You could see that in the top 8. There was Elixir, there was a disruptive element, there was these Icelander decks playing more mid-range, there was these Ultim, there was an Ultim Fatigue, there was, there was actual representation of these different type of archetypes and ways to play the game, which I think is more a healthy representation than just the fact that there was a good even spread of heroes.
Yeah, I would like to end by saying that the more diverse the pie is, like, I think in general, the better the meta is. Like, if there is a higher number of heroes of, differing heroes in a top 8 or showing up to tournaments like that is generally a good indicator of a better meta, but it's just not necessarily all the time. I think some people will just look at a hero pie and just be like, okay, that's diverse, it's a good meta, and that's not the case. I think that you have to drill down to like what strategies are actually viable and like, is there any variety to the gameplay?
Yeah. It's definitely not a causation there. It's not. Yeah, I agree. Cool. Well, thank you for the question. If you want to get your questions into the Command and Cookout, you can email us at arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. It's been 2 weeks and I've forgotten what our email address is, Brendan. You can drop a comment in the YouTube comments below. Let us know it's for the Command and Cookout, the question. You can DM us on Twitter. You can drop them in the Discord. Anyways, Brendan, I think it's time to move on to the main topic and introduce now 2-time calling player plus 2-time national champion, Tariq Patel. Mm-hmm. Main topic of the pod time. Welcome back to Arsenal Pass, Tariq Patel. Tariq, how are you?
I'm doing good. What's going on with you, both of you?
Well, first of all, I want to say a big congratulations for your top 8 in Indianapolis a couple of weeks ago. We were talking before the pod about how many callings you've top 8'd in. 2, which I would have thought in my head was more, but of course, when there were multiple callings going on, Orlando, you were too busy winning nationals, and you didn't play Vegas, which is the first North American calling. So I would say only 2 top 8s, but I mean, obviously that's a massive achievement. Just you've played less than I would have thought. So again, congratulations for your top 8 with Briar.
Thank you, appreciate it. Yeah, trying to get my girl Living Legend, but didn't end up happening.
A few people tried, as it looked like, over the past couple of weekends, but some Guardians and Icelanders have had something to say about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Definitely surprised about Oldham, though. Was not expecting as much Oldham in the top tables as what we ended up seeing. So I guess we'll get into that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Brendan, why don't you let us know a little bit about, I guess, what's been happening over the last couple of weeks with these events?
Yeah, well, let's just start from the very, very top, which is the bans. So, obviously, Tariq, but in case anybody here lives under a rock, Belittle was banned, Winter's Whale was banned, Amulet of Ice is suspended until Icelander becomes Living Legend, Hypothermia, same thing. Tariq, do you feel like these bans were adequate? Do you feel like they had a effect on the meta? And if you have any other general thoughts, let's just hear them.
So I think everybody, when the bans were first announced, thought that they were fundamentally good ways to hit the top 3 decks. We had Icelander, Phi, and Oldham as the 3 best decks leading into, the current metagame we're in. And I think Belittle hitting Phi, Winter's Whale, and Hypothermia hitting Oldham, and then Icelander obviously being nerfed with Amulet of Ice and Hypothermia. We all thought those 3 decks got taken down a peg. And I think for the most part, everybody kind of thought Icelander was a little bit underwater. I think I even went so far to tweet it out that, man, they did Icelander dirty. And I thought she was really underpowered going into, the week of testing leading up to the calling Indianapolis. And it wasn't until midway through the week that I think everybody kind of simultaneously, as they were testing, realized, hey, Icelander's good again. And, Michael Hamilton in the MNR podcast put out a thing saying, hey, we're playing Icelander, guys. I put out a tweet saying, hey, everybody should be prepared for Icelander because it's a real deck. But I like the ban overall. I thought it did an adequate job nerfing Oldham and nerfing Phi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually tweeted out something pretty similar and thought the same thing. And my pitfall was I was a bit ignorant to how much Phi losing Belittle would affect Phi's ability to sort of compete in that matchup, because I felt like as Icelander, I felt like the Phi matchup was a bit tight once Belittle came into the into the deck, and I thought, just after these bans that Fi might run over that deck, but I didn't appreciate what Fi Sans Belittle looked like. And yeah, Icelander seems to have won out. But I mean, the tail of the tape really was, it was Oldhim. 5 Oldhims in the top 8. I don't think anybody expected that. Winter's Wail is obviously a massive hit on the deck. Crown of Seeds is kind of, we had people sort of maybe complaining that should have been the hit. It should have been the hit now. But what are your thoughts, on Oldhim specifically, and also Oldhim's, I like to call it Oldhim's stepbrother, Bravo. But what are your thoughts on the 2 Guardians sort of performing in this meta? We had a lot of Bravo show up, didn't perform, and we also had a lot of Oldhim show up and perform. Oldhim specifically, I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so for me personally, Oldhim was actually a huge surprise. And ever since Prism was banned, I've been on Oldhim, up until the calling Indianapolis. I won my nationals with Oldhim. My 2 other teammates won their nationals with Oldhim. So we've been very Oldhim focused the entire time. I'm very comfortable with the deck. I can play it into every matchup. So if there was ever a reason to play Oldhim, I would try and trick myself, at least, subconsciously, into playing Oldhim. So for me to give up Oldhim going into the calling really meant that, me and my teammates, because Matt actually ended up making the trip down, and he as well didn't play Oldhim. We thought there were fundamental problems with the deck, and I still do think those problems exist to the day. So I was actually probably one of the most surprised people to find out, what was it, 4, 5 Oldhims that ended up top rating, the calling. And I'm gonna go tangent on a little bit, but there was a famous Nobel Prize economist that won in, I think, like 2018, where he talks about the irrational market theory. Because beforehand, markets always kind of went supply, demand, and you were supposed to act rationally. And he went and showed, no, the markets are made up of people, and people are irrational, so markets will be irrational. And I think a lot of that is what we saw in the metagame as well. Because when we were testing Oldhim, one of the big problems we first identified was we can't beat Briar anymore. Because if Briars came prepared with either Evergreen or Rites of Replenishment packages, you couldn't fatigue them anymore, which was, you were previously able to do that with Hypothermia. And you couldn't outrace them, which was already kind of dicey even before with Hypothermia. So if you couldn't fatigue them, you couldn't outrace them, what axis were you beating them on? So we gave up on it because we're like, if people come prepared and play optimally, I don't like arguably the most prevalent matchup in the metagame, which it did. I think Briar was the most prevalent deck in Indianapolis. What we didn't account for was the irrationality of the metagame, where there were a lot of teams, I don't want to call anybody out specifically, but there were a lot of groups of high-level players that just wrote it off, being like, oh, we don't need a fatigue package, we're just going to beat Oldhims. And as they unfortunately found out, it didn't necessarily work out like that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the dichotomy between the 2 Oldhim builds that showed up? We saw a pretty clean split, I guess, between the more proactive decks and then these fatigue-oriented decks. Were you favoring either strategy going into the calling?
So we've had the fatigue version on the back of our mind for a while now. Nick Butcher actually calls it Ointment Oldhim because healing bombs and ointment. So that was the kind of name for the fatigue deck in our group. But it had a couple of fundamental flaws. So what the viewers or listeners should understand about that deck is that healing salve effects or healing effects are only good when your opponents play inefficiently, right? So those cards are very bad against, let's say, a deck like Fi that can use every card in its hand every turn, because it will functionally just be a block 3, but that block 3 also requires your action point. Or if you were to block with a healing bomb, it would just block for 2. So those decks are best when there's inefficient decks in the format, like a lot of Ranger, maybe some Dash, etc. And the other thing is that it's actually not great in the mirror either, because the 10s, like Glacial Footsteps, Thunderquakes, and all the big red attacks, they actually require you to block with more cards. So if you trade down cards to the late game, you're actually behind in cards in deck, even though your life total might be okay, and then it'll go to fatigue. So going into it, I've never been a fan of the fatigue Oldhim strategy because, 1, I don't like its mirror match. 2, I don't like its aggro match particularly well. And then 3, Icelanders, if they have enough time and they figure out what you're on ahead of time, they can sometimes set up, and you saw Michael Hamilton do that in the finals, and they can play differently. Like, they don't have to register the Ironhide gauntlets. They can play Metacarpus. So I've never been a fan of the deck. I've always kind of led more towards the mid-range version.
Icelander is a really interesting one off the back of Indianapolis. I think a lot of people had questions in their mind with Amulet of Iceban if Icelander could still consistently combo some of these more fatigue-oriented Oldhim decks, and if it could compete against some of these aggressive decks with Hypothermia leaving the format. So, in lieu of those bans, do you think that both of those things still stand correct? That Icelander can beat Fatigue Oldhim, Icelander still can consistently combo, and it's still a powerful deck or a powerful answer to some of these aggro decks?
Yeah, so the Fatigue Oldhim matchup is still a big question mark for me because with the losing of Amulet of Ice, before they had a very potent threat where they could set up multiple amulets, and if the Insidious Shells didn't line up, they could still strip your hand and then kill you in one foul swoop. Now it's a little bit more tricky. Michael Hamilton had the advantage of knowing exactly what his opponent was on in the finals, and he was able to customize his deck in a little bit of a way that he could really pinpoint and target it. Now, if you're sitting across from, Joe Smith at a calling and he flips over Oldhim, you don't necessarily know what kind of Oldhim build he's going to be doing. So it's going to be interesting going forward to see how Icelanders choose to balance it out between, how hard into the combo do I lead? Do I board out all my defense reacts, or do I keep some in? I don't know that question yet. In terms of aggro decks, I will definitely say it's gotten a little bit better for the aggro decks. Like I think pre-ban, Briar was 0% into Icelander. Like I think that matchup was about as unwinnable as it got. And now, my teammates or the group I tested with, I guess, that also played Briar in the calling, I think we were undefeated against Icelander right up until I lost my quarterfinals match to Icelander. And then even my match in the quarterfinals, I felt very winnable in a number of spots. I just needed a couple things to go right, and they went wrong. But that went from like a 0% matchup, excuse me, to maybe like a 40% matchup. Still unfavored, but definitely winnable.
Mm-hmm. That leaves one more sort of on our list here in terms of what top 8 in Indianapolis, and that's going to be you on Briar. What made you pick that deck? Do you still feel confident in the decision? Would you bring it to a calling next weekend if there was one? Just what's sort of the takeaway on Briar sort of pre and post tournament?
Yeah, so like we kind of talked about, every content creator, everybody that kind of gave their opinion on the metagame when the BNR was first released had Icelander very low on their tier list, and myself included. And information's hard to come by. It's just really difficult to look at a theory and just like accurately predict a metagame. So if you actually look at the metagame breakdown, that I tweeted, I don't know, Tuesday before the calling, and I said, this is what I think the rank of heroes would be. Briar didn't actually have a bad matchup going into the week. It wasn't until, Wednesday night that we figured out, hey, Icelander is probably a real deck, and, we might need to consider it a little bit more, that Briar started to have maybe one bad matchup in the metagame. Lexi is another bad matchup, and actually Azalea is a really rough matchup. But those decks tend to be, a little less prevalent in the metagame, and we had a good game plan into it with Talisman of Warfare, so I felt okay into Lexi. So if you ignore Icelander, Briar just felt like the obvious choice to me. You'd have to beat the Mirror, which we had pretty good tech to. Oops. Which we'd have pretty good tech into with our 6 snatches. But besides that, didn't really have a bad matchup until Icelander kind of came out on Wednesday, Thursday. But at that point, I figured, everybody else would have been in the same boat I was, where unless you were an Icelander matchup going into this metagame, you probably wouldn't feel comfortable picking it up with only 48 hours of testing to take into the calling.
Mm-hmm. So what about post-tournament? Post-tournament, do you still feel like Briar's deck you would potentially play in a calling if said one was to come up next weekend?
Yeah, so I was thinking about going to Auckland for a long time. I just actually finally shot the idea down in my mind today that I'm probably not going to make the calling in Auckland. But if there was a calling in Auckland, Briar would be one of the 3 or 4 decks that were on my radar. If you don't think Icelander is going to be as prevalent, I think Briar is just the clear pick. If you want to play one of the tier 1 decks, I think there's only Icelander and Briar. If you want to play a deck that attacks the metagame, I think you're better off with either Dash or a deck like Bravo or Oldhim, like one of the Guardians.
Mm-hmm. Tariq, do you think in terms of Icelander and just where that sat in the meta, because you were talking before about, in the lead up, Icelander was written off for a lot of people, including Brendan, if you recall. But with your claim that by Baltimore, Icelander would fall off, which, very well could still happen. But I guess my question aligned with that, Tariq, is do you think people suffered from not respecting Icelander? You know, we saw 2 Icelander make top 8. Icelander had I think the best conversion from day 1 to day 2 in Indianapolis. Also showed up in Bologna as well. Do you think people suffered a little bit from disrespecting Icelander in terms of, you know, Briars, for instance, cutting cards they'd previously played to try and shore up that matchup, for instance, or the Ultims just kind of dismissing that matchup and not having the cards that they had previously ready for that matchup?
Yes and no. So specifically for the calling Indianapolis, I think it was right to disrespect Icelander because, you know, like I said, even if it was a good deck, and it turns out Icelander is still one of the best decks in the format. What was it? Only 26 people day 2 or something? Like it was
13 day 2, 26 showed up. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was still a very small representation. So I think it was reasonable, and I kind of said this to the group of Canadians that came with me, and I managed to psyops into playing Briar, that even if you play against an Icelander opponent, or like even if Icelander is the best deck in the room, or you know whatever it may be, you know what percentage of the field is actually going to be on it. You know, we may only play against it once. You know, I think if you play against it twice, you're actually running cold. So leading up to the event, you could say, yeah, people maybe were a little bit underprepared, but I don't think you were punished too hard by making that assumption. I think it ended up being right looking at the numbers in retrospect.
Yeah, so maybe more of a fact of what punished players for, I guess, not being prepared for was, like you say, Briar's not necessarily being prepared for the ultimate matchup, not having those evergreens or the rights replenishment package, or maybe Earthful Surge is another card that's pretty important in that matchup typically. That I know obviously you had some of that package.
Yeah, and so Oldham was on our radar for sure because like we know people like Guardian, so we expected some amount of Guardian, and you know if you're playing Guardian, some percentage of them will fatigue you. So to me, those 2 slots felt more or less free. The Icelander matchup though, like I said, what can you really do as a Briar player? You bring in Oasis Respite. I think Isaac actually ended up adding one last second because we tested the Icelander matchup, and he wanted exactly one for the Stormstrider's pop-off turn. But I don't know how much percentage that really added. And even going into the tournament, Flesh and Blood's such a funny game where you can kind of look at the people in the room and kind of be like, I'm probably going to lose to this at some point. I just hope it's later rather than sooner. And I actually said going in, I'm like, I feel very confident with our 80 card deck. We had the Snyx Snatches to make a pretty big edge in the mirror for what I felt. I bet you the only way I lose is to an Icelander player at some point. And then it ended up coming true that I lost to Majin Bay in a very close top 8 match.
Well, let's talk about the Snyx Snatches. So you feel like the Snyx Snatch, was that the main card change that you felt like gave your Briar deck equity over the rest of the field? I know you said it specifically for the mirror, but is that the biggest deviation that you guys had?
Yeah, so our list, I think, was based off of Chris. I'm going to get his last name right. I think it's Ilali.
I think it's Iali.
Ilali. Yeah, pardon that. So it was largely based off that, and which I guess was previously based off of like the Chris Hawk, the German national champion deck list. So they've always kind of been prototypical with a couple flex slots to go. So I think my list specifically, I had like 12 sideboard cards, which was like 6 poppers. 2 of those were evergreen. I then had the anti-Lexi package, and then the 3 yellow snatches. But yeah, I would say the yellow snatches were the biggest deviation I had in my deck, along with the Talisman of Warfare for the Ranger matchup. And I really do think it gives you not just an edge against the Briar decks, but all the aggro matchups. We're talking Phi, Dash, even against Dromai, just having an extra on hit against a dragon to pop a dragon and then get an arsenal. The card is just extremely above rate, even at 3, because even if your opponent has to block with a card, in Flesh and Blood, offensive utility of a card is always going to be higher than defensive. So it's always just going to be an uneven exchange no matter what you do with a yellow snatch.
Mm-hmm. Well, it wouldn't be a Tariq Patel podcast unless we piss some people off. Let's talk about Bravo. So we had 42 Bravos show up, and we had 1 Bravo make it to day 2. So why are people coping so hard with this hero? Like, there's 2 Guardian. I mean, there's another Guardian to pick from. Some would argue strictly better. And I know, guys, I'm walking myself into the battle hardened Bologna Bravo win. But let's talk about the Indianapolis Bravo for a sec. That deck, a lot of people did show up on it. More people than I expected. I think that Bravo has, actually even recently, as it's creeped up and popular in the meta, sort of consistently performed badly at major events. But we did see a lot show up, and I think that Bravo's a deck that really plays on Fi specifically. And it looked like Fi was, Fi wasn't the most popular aggro deck, so maybe Bravo wasn't the right pick. What are your thoughts on that hero specifically?
So first of all, I have no idea what happened at the calling. Like the fact that one Bravo player day 2'd out of the 42 that showed up, it's just, what are the odds? Like what's going on there with those Bravo pilots? I don't know. It blows my mind because I think Bravo and Oldham have a very similar matchup spread almost across the board, right? Like unless you're playing the Fatigue Oldham, I'm talking mid-range Oldham here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Oldham and Bravo are still favored into, Dash, Fi, Dromai, really favored into Dromai, really favored into Dromai, Bolton, Kano, Katsu, whatever deck you kind of want to say. I think all those Guardian decks, Bravo and Oldham, have similar matchup spreads across. I think where those two decks really differ are how they play into the Oldham mirror or the Guardian mirror. So I think the Crown of Seeds and Tunic specifically do give you a bit of an edge into the Guardian mirror, and how they play into Icelander, which I actually think Bravo is way better than Oldham into the Icelander matchup. So in my opinion, and still to this day, I think that Bravo is the better of the two heroes because of that. I think they're both equally unfavored into Briar. I think Icelander matchup is far superior for Bravo than it is Oldham because of the dominate potential and ability to kind of end a game. And I think, the mirror match got a lot closer. Like Crown of Seeds and Tunic is a thing, but Winter's Well to me was like the big kind of boogeyman because what it ended up doing was it really threw off the utility of Seismic Surges, right? You couldn't all of a sudden cleanly Crippling Crush off of just 3 cards anymore with a Seismic, or you couldn't like dominate on turns you'd wanted to. And Oldham was really good at being able to go like Cycle Crown, block with 3 cards, come at you with a Winner's Well, and Arsenal another card. And to me, previously, that was a big part to that matchup, and it's lost that now. So I think that matchup's gotten a lot closer to 50%, and then the Icelander matchup is still very, in my opinion, I'd rather be playing Bravo than I would Oldham. So right now, for me, I know you disagree, Brendan, but I would personally be on Bravo if I was to play a Guardian.
I'll hold you to it. If I ever see you on Oldham, I'm like... Oh my! But let's talk about Dromai. Dromai is this deck that I see. I mean, it showed up in numbers, and it converted. I mean, it converted badly, but not terribly, right? 15.7% into day 2. What do you think about Dromai and its function in the meta? Is it serving as a pseudo prism? What role is it currently filling?
The role it's filling is by providing this type of copium to illusionist players that they can't get anywhere else. It's just. Like I don't know what it is with illusionist players, and I'm gonna get hate. I really don't care at this point. It's like you tell them they have a bad matchup, they will lose their minds. Like I remember, and I think I have a money match. So somebody finally took me up on it. Just to digress a little bit, I put out an open challenge about 2 weeks ago because I just kind of made a tweet like I listed out like 8 heroes I was testing, and in there was like a small blurb about Dromai. I'm like, I like this deck. It does a lot of good things. I don't like its Guardian matchup. Like that's all I said. The amount of messages I got in both DMs, Purple Discord, tweets at me being like, "You're wrong. You have no idea." Like like this matchup's the buy. I'm like, you guys are insane. So I put an open offer. I'm like, any Dromai player that wants to play me for $100, I will play you for any amount of money, anytime. Go ahead. I didn't get peeps, crickets. I went to the Purple Discord. I was talking shit. I was like, "What's up? Like, I'll take your money." I finally got one person, Darkodius from the Purple Discord, who has been kind of bullied by the entire Dromai community to be their champion. So we're gonna stream that and kind of make a video on that. And I think we're gonna play Thursday night. But anyways, I think that's a long way away. I think Dromai is a good deck. I think it's a balanced illusionist hero, which I think will appropriate itself at some point in the metagame. I think it has some errors and some flaws right now. Like it has a terrible Briar matchup. It has a terrible Guardian matchup. But I like its matchups otherwise. And it does really cool things. But it's hard to balance, right? In Flesh and Blood, permanents are this concept that is kind of foreign. And you really have to be careful because if they're slightly too good, like we saw with Prism, where they rob you of your action point, they can really snowball into a kind of degenerate and unfun playing pattern. But I think Dromai is just right. I think from a design standpoint, it's a really cool hero, and I think it does exactly what it needs to do in the metagame. Do I think it's the best deck with no bad matchups like the purple Discord things? No, it definitely has some real fundamental flaws.
This is, it's so par for the course with like these kind of roleplay-esque archetypical decks where it's like, okay, Dromai is good, but it has a bad matchup against like aggro or something, and they're like, no, aggro's a buy. And you're like, okay, Dromai is good, but it has a bad matchup against control. It's like, no, control is a buy, and you're like, wait, what? Everything is a buy. Well, I think that's the Kano copium too. Is like every matchup is a buy.
You know what's a funny story? I'm gonna digress here, but like, I think it was at Worlds. Yeah, it was at Worlds where I was watching Hayden play Kano, and it was a cycle to the point that my friend group now makes fun of me because every time I watch Hayden or yourself play Kano, I talk to you guys, and I don't know if you remember this discussion, Hayden, but you were like, tell me different lines and combos at Worlds. You're like, okay, do this. I'm saying, I'm like, yeah. That sounds really good. And then without fail, I come home from these events and I jump on Talishar and I like play Kano nonstop. And I'm like, okay, the math doesn't check out. Like, it just doesn't work for me. Like, I run into a thing. I'm like, yeah, that's what I thought before was right. And then I just know the next time I go to an event and I see Haydendale playing Kano, I'm going to be like, yeah. Tell me about that combo. I'm just getting right back into it. I'm going to be wasting another 2 weeks playing Kano.
We had this discussion at dinner actually after Worlds. You were like, Kano just makes no sense. Like Voltic Bolt, you're like 2 for 5. Like it's terrible math. I was like, dude, what do you mean? Like the combo's 32 damage. You're like, what do you mean the combo's 32 damage?
When you say that, I was just like, oh, that's a good point. 32 is a lot of damage.
Yeah, but when
we go home again, then I'm like, all right, never mind. I'm off this deck again. So I don't know.
When your opponent starts at 10 life, though, Voltic Bolt is half their life. So,
true.
you know.
True. So just a matter of perspective, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, let's go talk about what the hell these Italians are doing. So, Battle Hardened Bologna, and you can tell me if I said that wrong. We had about a 5-minute debate on how to say that freaking name. The top 8, let's just go into that. This is top 8. 2 Icelander, 1 Oldhim, 1 Bravo, 1 Jermai, 1 Viscerai, 1 Lexi, 1 Phi. What the hell are they doing over there in Europe? And by the way, Bravo won that tournament. Any takeaways from this diverse top 8 metagame off the back of Indianapolis, which looked to be quite a bit more homogenized? Do you think that this is sort of the gold standard? Have they evolved the metagame? Is the metagame actually this open?
I mean, Europeans are built different. We know that. The Oldhim part of it actually makes sense to me. Like, this is what I actually thought Oldhim would kind of be going into the event. Because one, the fatigue Oldhim also has to convince people, like, when they've deterministically won, even though they haven't won the game, they have to get a concession at some point, and it's hard. I saw a number of concessions at Indianapolis that probably should have just gone to draws, so maybe that wasn't happening in Europe. I'm not sure. I'm not privy to it. Maybe the Oldhams were just running into Briars. You know, Briar was one of the most prevalent decks there. I don't know, but the conversion rate of Oldham is more in line to kind of what I expected going into the calling Indianapolis. My explanation there is the Europeans were probably just way more prepared than the North Americans were. That's my opinion, but we'll see going forward. To me, the biggest surprise of this top 8 was no Briars. Mm-hmm. You know, given the diversity of this metagame, like the Oldham, the Bravo, the Dromai, the Viscera, the Lex, blah, 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 Briar crushes all these decks, right? Its only true bad matchup is Icelander and a flip versus Lexi. So that to me was the biggest surprising part, that Briar was one of the most prevalent decks at 13% of the metagame and didn't convert at all into the top 8. I'm wondering what happened there. And Icelander, I'm not surprised. I think it's a top tier hero like Briar. So I'm not surprised to see that it put 2 into top 8.
Briar is actually tied for the number 1 deck with Icelander at 13%. We also did see Dash at and Dash at 13%, which didn't convert. Dash also had a very bad conversion in Indianapolis as well. But I mean, honestly, this top 8 looks it's even though it's diverse, it's not very surprising. I think the only deck that particularly surprises me in there is Viscerai, which I still think is like, it's a good deck. It's just, it doesn't feel like a great deck. Like Lexi running hot in terms of a matchup spread can be an incredible deck, right? Running into Phi's and Briars up until it hits top 8. And then we just had like a Jermai and sneak up in there. And Bravo, I guess, as well. per my philosophy, that should be surprising. But it really isn't. I think Bravo's actually quite good into the aggro decks. I differ with you on the opinion that if I'm on the other matchups, I find myself often wanting to be the Oldhim, and I think that Oldhim has a similar spread against some of those aggro decks as well. But I mean, it bodes well for a healthy metagame, maybe leading into the Pro Tour. What do you think?
I think one thing you want to look at though as well is that you talk about Lexi. like Lexi, when I looked at the Bologna breakdown when they posted, I was like, wow, like if you're playing Lexi in this meta, you're in a really good spot. I was actually thought we might get more than one Lexi in that top 8 because 12% of the field was Guardian. Like Ultim was only 7% played in Bologna, and Bravo was like 5 or 6% played. And then Droma was, reasonable representation, 4th most played deck, but only 11% of the meta. The rest of the matchups is Lexi. Like I'm good to play into Briars, Dashes, Icelanders. Like I'm not that worried about like fires. So I think it's Bologna felt like an evolution to me of what happened, although it looks maybe less so, like of what happened at the calling the week before in Indianapolis, because people started to pick up a little bit more of, Icelander, for instance. Like Icelander was number 1 played deck, whereas in the week before in Indianapolis it wasn't. Like people, I think, were responding to the information that they had at hand, and that diversified it a bit more interestingly, I think. Although I would have expected to see more Ultim than we did, which we didn't. But yeah, I think Bologna is quite an interesting event, actually. And I think you've got to remember as well, it's a battle hardened, which is a little bit different to a calling, I think. People are more willing to travel to a calling, and because they're traveling, want to play, I think, better decks, play the best decks, and give themselves the most chance. And I think you do start to see, like, the higher level of an event, I think the more you see divergence of a metagame convergence of a metagame as opposed to divergence, maybe a smaller event where people are playing decks they want to play.
I think it's particularly interesting that only 6.8% of people showed up on Oldhim off the back of a very recent 5 Oldhims in top 8 of a major tournament. It's either like players over there, were ahead of it and felt like they understood something about the meta that the players in Indianapolis didn't, or they potentially weren't playing the deck in lieu of the ban. But 6.8% after 5 in the top 8 is very, very low.
Same as Ryan.
I'm just going to chalk it up to Europeans being intelligent because, like I said, I love Oldhim. I won nationals on Oldhim. They probably came to the same conclusion I did, that this deck cannot be Briar. If we think Briar is going to be one of the most prevalent decks, why in the hell are we playing Oldhim? I don't know. I'm going to chalk that up to Europeans just being more intelligent than we are.
Yeah, Europe in general is at least as we led up into Worlds, they were playing Briar when the US just like almost wasn't. Like our entire battle hardened circuit was just like void of Briar. And lo and behold, you go to fast forward to the World Championships, it showed up in force and made it the top 8. So yeah, I think that I think in terms of general metagame knowledge, Europe tends to be ahead of the United States, it seems like, after the back of these World Championships and Pro Tours.
Could we talk a little bit about Dash? Because Dash was, as you say, equal first played in Bologna, and I believe it was like the 4th most played deck, and yeah, it was like almost the same as Fi. It was more than Bravo in Indianapolis, and not a shred of a top 8 between the two events for Dash, and pretty poor conversion to day 2 in Indianapolis. I think it had like slightly better conversion than Reinhardt, but worse conversion than Kano and Bolton. So, Tariq, what's your kind of take on Dash? I know your teammate at the event, Matt Rogers, played Dash. Do you guys think it was in a good position? Do you think, just showed up with the wrong type of Dash?
Dash is probably the hardest archetype to fully understand with just a general principle. Because there's 4 ways to build Dash, right? We have what Jacob Bollock's called the tree frog Dash, the full defense reaction Dash type deck. You have
names, dude. Ointment, tree frog, like what the hell?
Yeah, I didn't know.
I had in your control decks.
I had to get him to explain it to me. I'm like, why is it called tree frog? He's like, springboard and frogs hop, so it's a tree frog. And I'm like, whatever. You played the deck to fame. I'm gonna call it whatever you want. So you have the full D-React Dash deck. Then you have the mid-range traditional Dash deck, right? You play pistol chamber into whatever you play. Defense reacts items into Guardians. Then you have, the deck that I was testing leading up to the calling, which was Hayden's, I like to call it Habibi Blaster, but what is it actually called? Hanabi Blaster. Yeah, Habibi Blaster sounds better, culturally. But yeah, you have Hanabi Blaster, and I think that is like a super interesting take on Dash that I think is really, really underexplored. And it fixes a lot of the weird deck building issues where Dash had to be previously bipolar and boost into one type of matchup, defend into another. So to me, this Dash kind of stuff really comes down to, I don't think we found what the most optimal build yet. And I think Hayden's really close in his video. I probably watched that video like 3 or 4 times myself leading up to the calling. And I think, there's going to be a nice kind of mid-range build. And I will say, we didn't get there for the calling. I gave up on it several days in advance. Matt, obviously being Dash guy, continued working on the deck. But even he didn't come to a list that he thought was 100% optimal. And we actually switch plans, halfway through the event. He switches Briar matchup plan halfway through the event. He switches Icelander plan, I believe, as well. So I think things are still being worked on and figured out, even by the best Dash players in the world. And that's kind of why we're seeing these poor conversions. But I think once they figure it out, we're going to see Hayden Dale come out with another Dash video, but like, guys, I freaking did it. And it's just going to be him calling Auckland champion or something. I don't know.
See you there.
We'll see.
All right. Well, let's talk about the future and like what this metagame looks like for the Pro Tour. But first, retrospective. Do you think that the bans were good in post these events? Do you think that the bans did what they were intended to do, and do you think that the game is in a healthier spot as a result?
Yeah. So I think there's another ban system ended in a week, and it's going to be interesting. I think they targeted what was supposed to be targeted. Now, there's a lot of questions in a lot of discussion, even among LSS in their BNR announcement. They kind of alluded to they really don't want to ban legendaries. But there's going to be a fundamental question now where it's like, how many of these cards can you ban when the actual problem may actually be the legendaries themselves, right? Like, is Crown of Seeds really the oppressive card out of Oldham? Is it Storm Shredders that's the issue out of Icelander? And we'll see going forward. I think the Oldham bans were really good. I think the Phi bans were really good, maybe even a little bit too hard. I kind of like Belittle as a card design. I thought it was one of the most interesting cards in Flesh and Blood, so I'm really sad to see that one go. I think Icelander is still top tier and may require an additional tweak in the future. We'll see what they do in a week. But the question comes down to, if they need to ban a legendary item, is that healthy for the game? How do they go about doing that? If it was me, if I would maybe only suspend a legendary from a single class just so you're not completely nuking it completely out of the game. But I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think they should always prioritize the health of the game over the economy of the secondary market or the collectability of the game. Like, we talked about this in a recent pod, because Marvel Snap is going through the exact same thing with like a couple busted season pass cards in the recent 2 months, and then they nerfed them actually a month after, which is a lot sooner than you would expect. It's fast, right? People are going to complain. I think people would complain in Flesh and Blood too, but if it is what's necessary to make the game healthy, I think that it's 100% their correct decision too. They showed they're not 100% unwilling to do it, because they went after Storm Shredders, although that wasn't a ban. They did flip that around pretty quickly, but I think that they're willing to do it, but they will exhaust other options before going that route, which I believe is what we've seen.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we're facing another ban suspended announcement, like you say, Tariq. I think I just had a quick look. It's March 20th, so it's going to be just as Outsiders drops. So we'll get Auckland, and then I think this is a time for them to reassess, right? Like, before Outsiders comes out, is there any additional changes needed? And from what I see, Outsiders doesn't seem like it's going to change the existing decks that much, right? Just given the nature of the set and the classes that are in it. But I think what I think LSS want to happen, I think it's pretty clear at this point, is they just want Briar to Living Legend, right? Like, they really want Briar to hit Living Legend before Outsiders, to have a bit more of a clean slate, and then assess where the impacts of Icelander bans are, the Oldham bans are. I think right now my kind of takeaway is similar to yours. Oldham, I think, has been hit pretty well. Phi, likewise. Icelander, I still think has been hit pretty well. I think I always have a fundamental problem with Icelander, and the fact that you get to pack your deck full of good, powerful blues, and that's that's what your deck does, and so that mitigates a lot of things like variance, etc. Because your deck's just full. So there's a lot of things I have a problem with just Icelander in general, but I think these two bans, particularly, of course, Hypothermia, but Amulet of Ice also being so strong at what it does, I think this will see them through into Outsiders at least. And then I think it's going to be a case of, okay, based on what they know about the set and the decks and the metagame they expect within it, is there any additional tweaks that need to be made? And I think that's what we'll see sort of come out of it.
I think that they'll do nothing. If you looked at the data, I think they're going to go off the data, because there's not much to else to pull from other than player sentiment. And I think that they'll especially look at the battle hardened, and probably check this up to be a healthy spot for the game. I think that Icelander, it is still powerful, but it's not nearly what it was before. Oldham, although it performed well at Indianapolis, I would think that deck would suffer a bit more. Like 5 Oldhams in the top 8 is something I would have expected a lot more when Winter's Whale was still a thing. So I think that decks can adapt, and I do think that this ban suspended announcement is more likely to bring no changes rather than any changes at all.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
If Icelander shits on all the new heroes and outsiders, though, in its current state of form, then I think they would look to do something, right? Like, I think that's what they're going to look at rather than, you say, the current format. I think the current format is a little bit irrelevant. They wanted to make it healthy for Indianapolis and Auckland and see out this format in a healthy manner and have Briar Living Legend and then come into outsiders. And I think there could be some revision, but it would be forward focused on the next format. It wouldn't be much to do with the current format.
I actually think you're right in the sense that I think it's I do think it's very important for them that Outsiders actually has an impact on Classic Constructed, because Dynasty had less so, or maybe more of a delayed impact. And yeah, Icelander, the power level of Icelander and what used to be Oldham was very prohibitive to a new set of heroes actually making an impact on Flesh and Blood, because they felt so far above the others, right? It was just, I felt like you had to be so compelled to play something that wasn't Fi, Oldham, or Iceland pre-ban, and it's different now, but not too different. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's going to be in the context of Outsiders, and they do want those heroes to be playable at the highest level.
I will say, sorry, real quick, I will say the only thing I want to have happen on the next BNR is the Horn suspended. I think that card only exists in the most degenerate gameplay patterns of Flesh and Blood, and I don't know if it's necessarily healthy for it. That's all I'll say.
It's a pretty reasonable take, to be honest. I think I was going to just kind of add on is when you're talking with Brendan about those heroes and why would you play anything else in those kind of sets, is we also, LSS are doing a bit of a realignment post Monarch and Tales of Aria and the power level of those formats. So from Monarch, we have come down in power level progressively, and even Uprising was somewhat, a degress down in Dynasty as well. I expect that once we sort of level out a bit, Briar leaves. I think it's a big milestone for them. Oldham's probably the next one, or Crown of Seeds, whatever way you look at it. I think that allows space for a set like Dynasty to become more important as we go through. I think, like you say, right now, it's the delay might be even longer than you might anticipate for Dynasty's impact on Classic Constructed.
Yeah, it does feel like some of those top decks would just boil down to do number better. Like they were just fundamentally like they were just getting more value on turn by turn basis. Tariq, I got one last question for you, or one of a few last questions. Do you think Icelander is the best deck right now?
Yeah, I think it's one of the top 2 decks. I think in a vacuum, if you were to pick a deck into a blind metagame, you should either be taking Briar or Icelander.
Okay. What do you think of like dark horses that could creep up? Obviously, Outsiders is going to bring tons of new stuff, but if you were just looking at the current metagame, anything that we didn't talk about that you think that is actually good? Like, is the Lumina go Boomina? Is that real? What about Kano? Like, anything else?
What? The
Lumina go Boomina. You play multiple Luminas and it go
oh,
Boomina.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you're uncultured here. This
a hero that doesn't exist.
So you know what's funny? What a lot of people don't know about me, and we were talking about this after the calling Indianapolis, was that I am like a huge Ranger simp, and I love Azalea. And I think Azalea is like super close to being extremely good. I'm not even memeing like when I say this. Like when I tell you that I think her aggro matchups are very close to unlosable, and the fact that she has very consistent dominate means that her Guardian matchups are very close to winnable. I could see, because you asked about dark horses, I could see Azalea being the next big thing after this set.
Yeah. I mean, I still think Kano is pretty good, and I do.
I'm not going back down this rabbit hole the third time.
I mean, you guys can all talk shit about Kano, but then Hayden's gonna maybe show up to the PT or Wells on Kano again. We're gonna be like, here we go again. I mean, the deck is good. I mean, hopefully Arachne goes somewhere. Levia also 0% conversion. We didn't talk about that, but par for the course.
I agree with Ranger though. Like I think, like I said about Bologna, like Lexi was a great pick into that field, I think. And Lexi has the Amulet of Ice ban actually hit Lexi quite a bit, but like Lexi has quite a lot of tools, and like the fuseless sort of style of Ice Lexi that is quite aggressive. Like it's good into Icelander, for instance. Your matchup spread, if you're expecting lower Guardians, I think you can be pretty happy with that. And like you say, Bravo, for instance, I don't even think is that particularly a bad matchup for Lexi and those kind of builds as it stands, actually. So especially with the current builds that people are rolling out. So yeah, it's an interesting one. But what we can narrow it down to, Tara, probably is just more Tariq Patel psyops. That's what I'm hearing. That's that's what Twitter tells me. So ridiculous.
Yeah, you know what's funny is like Lexi was so close to top 8ing the calling in Indianapolis. I think Chris lost his winning in like the closest possible way to an Oldham, arguably the worst matchup. And it came down to like only a couple points of life. And I think Chris had a couple spots to maybe navigate those couple points. And I think he got a little bit unlucky in a couple spots, but we could have easily had a Lexi in that top 8 too. So I think Lexi's a very real deck, and people are sleeping on Ranger a little bit. Now, whether that's psyops or not, I'll let your viewers decide. I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see.
Well, yeah, I think we should unban drone too.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought we were just saying, crazy stuff. Sorry.
Well, when I show up to Auckland with Lexi, Brendan, probably not
unlikely.
Just so you know.
Unlikely. All right, Tariq, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you? What are you up to these days in terms of content? Tell us a little about Team Dragon Shield, the whole shebang.
Yeah, so same old places. I'm on Twitter, Tariq Patel 10. I still write articles when I kind of feel like it at Channel Fireball. I'm going to do kind of my 4 decks to choose for the calling Auckland in the upcoming week. And then I'm going to hope to post a cyborg guide for Briar leading into the calling Auckland. So stay tuned for that. And I might actually try streaming this week. So after my 4 decks article gets posted, I might take a couple of them to play on Talishar to prove that it's not psyops and those decks are actually very real into an open metagame.
I mean, the fact you have to prove that is absolutely bullshit. But anyway, stuff you, Fab Twitter.
All right. Well, thanks again, Tariq. I can't wait to see you at Pro Tour Baltimore. But until next time, man, yeah, good luck.
Episode 97 of Arsenal Pass in the books. Big thanks to Tariq Patel for joining us on the pod this week. Metagame looking very interesting as we close out this Dynasty meta heading towards Outsiders. Not far off from previous season. I'm sure once we come back next week I know Team Covenant, I think have an early preview that's dropping today or yesterday when this pod drops. So we'll have that information. There's going to be a lot of Outsiders talk as we head to episode 100 and the release of Outsiders. And of course, actually it's going to time out well with our episode 100-ish that we'll have probably our Outsiders review show as well. So looking forward to that. But anyway, Brendan, if you want to find him on Twitter, actually, you can find him at BrendanAPG. You can find me at Fian_Dale. And as I was about to say, until next week, we'll see you in the next episode.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget to French kiss that subscribe button, hit like, and shoot us a YouTube comment of what the heck a cyclone is.